In the brain of Morbius, we see the Doctor and Sarah Jane get taken off course from their journey home by the Time Lords, finding themselves on the planet of Karn. I love the way this story starts out with our main characters on this planet when it suddenly starts pouring down rain, and they soon find themselves guests to the man Solon at his very large castle. I just love how sometimes Doctor Who will give us such a wide variety of stories, because this is the kind of serial that you've probably seen before, at least in part. We start off feeling quite similar to a movie where, for example, a couple pulls over to a large mansion during intense weather and find themselves guests to the residents of that building, and it probably results in some really creepy stuff. So I love the way this story starts off in this rather familiar place, something you've probably seen before just with the TARDIS and the Doctor and Sarah Jane, and then it really plays with its setting and elements that viewers are likely familiar with, but does some interesting and fun things with them. And one of the elements that really stands out to me in this serial is its atmosphere. I love the style of this entire story, which is really contributed to by its setting in this haunted house, and by the gloomy weather and the lighting and the wind, and the strange ongoings of whatever Solon is up to. The atmosphere in this story is really fantastic, and I was very much enamored by what it was doing. In terms of the more almost Frankenstein elements, that is contributed to by, of course, the setting, but also by the characters of Solon and Kondo, who would in this comparison serve as Frankenstein and his assistant. But what they're working on is a little bit different than just reanimating a dead person. It's a little more complicated than that, and that's why this stuff all works so well, because it is borrowing familiar elements from other stories, but it is playing with them in different and entertaining ways. The Sisterhood of Karn honestly works rather well for me in this serial, serving as an additional element that helps to add another layer to what's going on here. They are this religion cult type of thing that also live on Karn, doing their best to protect the sacred flame. And there's a couple of reasons why their addition worked for me. Namely because it added another element, meaning that the story wasn't just set at the castle and didn't entirely revolve around the ongoings at one location, but also because they contribute a little bit to the feel of this one, with their repetitive chanting of sacred fire, sacred flame, sacred fire, sacred flame. It's largely pretty basic stuff, but I thought they helped in keeping the story engaging. Coming back a little bit to the Frankenstein elements, there is this body that Solon is working on, and I love the grotesque nature of it. I really like all of the different elements that have been shoved together to create this body. It's got a claw and a human arm, and I really liked how messed up that body was. It's not completely clear at first why Solon needs a head, but we do know that he needs one for what he's working on. It was actually quite nice to get reference to these aliens from a previous serial when we see Kondo bring him one of their heads, which is unsuitable for Solon's needs. It's just fun to every now and then get a fun reminder of previous stories and connect the universe of the show just a little bit by having some obscure species pop up again, though it was likely done for budgetary reasons. And we get this information about his needs or wants for a good head quite early on, which serves as a really good setup for when the Doctor and Sarah Jane arrive.
Let me take your hat, sir. What a magnificent head.
What?
Superb head.
Huh. Well, I'm glad you like it. I have had several. I used to have an old grey model before this. Some people liked it.
I did.
What?
And Solon is, I think, pretty well performed and an interesting character, if ultimately basically what you expect right from the start. At times the actor can be somewhat over the top, but he still does quite a good job on the whole, and I enjoyed seeing and learning about his motivations as he does everything he can trying to get the Doctor's head in order to meet his own ends. We actually also get hints about the titular character of Morbius, who the Doctor recognizes in a sculpture of his face, even mentioning that it was believed that Solon had joined the followers of the cult of Morbius. And I really enjoyed the way this story paces out the information it's giving you. It really does a good job at that, which is absolutely essential in balancing a serial. Here's the obligatory broken record section where I mention how much I love the Doctor and Sarah Jane. I know I say this every single time, but I have to mention it because they are the heart of the show and a truly wonderful pair to spend an episode with, and I just cannot get enough of these two. I'm not going to sit here for 2 minutes and waste your time with something that I mention every week, but it would be a failure in reviewing this episode if I didn't mention how much I love these characters. And the Doctor is his usual witty self.
Stop it! Stop it! Master!
What is the meaning of this?
Believe me, I meant no harm.
The harm is done. The sacrifice is defiled.
Take no notice, Solon. I'm delighted to see you.
silent.
That music was terrible.
Enough!
Even though he ultimately starts off being a little bit bitter about having been sent somewhere by the Time Lords, he still delivers some wonderful lines as always, and is just good fun. Once again, here is your spoiler warning. You can skip the time as shown on screen to avoid the spoilers for this story if you so wish, otherwise face them at your own risk as we continue in this discussion. For a great portion of this story, Sarah Jane finds herself blind, which I thought was an interesting decision and added something else for this serial to keep you invested. And because she was blind, she both gets more and less to do in this one, weirdly enough. I liked how that added an extra difficulty for the character, but it did also mean that she kind of wasn't able to do as much. That said, she still did some stuff on her own where she was wandering around completely unable to see, and those were some really good scenes because obviously we as a viewer have way more understanding of where she is than the actual character, so we just kind of see her doing her best to make her way around and often stumbling along the way. But she also still has some great moments.
The flash probably numbed the optic nerve. It'll wear off in a few hours. Come on.
Or not, is the case maybe.
Oh, Sarah.
Sorry.
Gently.
Hey, you know, I could always sell flowers, couldn't I? You know, lovely fresh violets come.
She's just such a great character. And I know I just played a clip, but bear with me because there's also this great line from the Doctor when he says to Sarah Jane,
Oh, Doctor.
You thought I was dead, didn't you? You're always making that mistake.
this was a great acknowledgement that this actually does seem to happen quite an awful lot, where Sarah Jane thinks that the Doctor has died and it turns out, never mind, he's actually fine. So I really appreciated that moment, and it felt like a good acknowledgement of what the show is and how it does reuse certain elements. I just thought it was a cute moment. Also, Solon's assistant Kondo works well enough. He is quite a simple character in that very little is done with him. I call him simple not in relation to his intelligence, though he is portrayed as not a particularly smart character, or at the very least, a person who does have trouble communicating. So while little is done with him, there was one moment I thought was great, when he finds out that this arm, which he has been wanting to be reattached to, instead of his hook, was actually used in Kondo's Frankenstein-like creation. This was, I thought, a quite interesting revelation and naturally pitted Kondo against Solon in what was, I suppose, a quite inevitable conflict. Now, Morbius is the Time Lord whose brain Sarah Jane finds, and we discover that this is the reason Solon needs the Doctor's head. He needs a head for Morbius's brain, and I like this angle of the story that these are indeed Solon's motivations. He wants to give Morbius a body, and he's this neurosurgeon who can actually possibly accomplish that goal. I thought it was quite a neat angle to approach the story from, and it makes it a little bit different from Frankenstein, which is a comparison I feel the story naturally draws, and the key difference here is that it is a brain that wants a body and not the other way around. I honestly just really liked that. And I also like this Time Lord, Morbius, who is so worried about the Time Lords finding him and him being completely powerless that he has Solon put him in this rather poorly put together body with a brain case. It really makes sense to me that he would be worried enough about this and in such dire need of a body that he doesn't care what that body is so long as it actually is one. It's kind of fascinating to think about that because what he does is understandable, but it's kind of unclear if it was the right decision. Should he have waited for a better head, or was this the right thing to do? I ultimately don't know for sure, and in retrospect things obviously didn't work out for him, but put in his position I might have made the same call, and regardless, it is an interesting situation to consider. And he does work quite well as this almost washed up villain whose best days are clearly behind him, because Solon is seemingly his only supporter, at least so far as we can tell from within this serial, and it's as though he has had these glory days of being worshipped by many, and now this is what he's reduced to. And this is how we are presented the character of Morbius within this one. And I found this to be quite an interesting way to introduce the character, and a little bit of a unique position to see him from, because we never fully get the picture of what he was back in the day, and we never actually see that. We only see where he's at now, and the desperate situation that he is in. This is a weird section because it's kind of a secondary spoiler section where I want to talk about future developments in the show and how they relate to this story. If you don't have any idea what I mean by that, you'll probably want to skip to the time as shown on screen to avoid spoilers for, specifically, Series 12 of the show, but if you're sticking with me, then we'll be discussing some elements from that series. There's this mind-bending scene between the Doctor and Morbius where this episode actually seems to imply that there were previous incarnations of the Doctor to the 4 that we have become familiar with up to this point. And what's odd for me is that it is kind of impossible to deal with this story entirely in isolation, because while I was aware of the Morbius Doctors before Series 12 aired, I now have this whole new understanding of the show. So while I would love to look at this in isolation and judge it as that, if I'm being honest, it's really hard for me to actually do that. And I don't know what I would have thought of this scene on its own, or what I would have made of it, but still, I do love this mind-bending scene towards the end of the episode. I can't help it. It's set up as something that should be impossible for the Doctor to beat Morbius at, but it's suggested within the episode that he might actually be able to because Morbius's brain is not in its prime. And that on its own would probably serve as enough of an explanation. But also knowing that the Doctor has had previous incarnations of the character also adds to why he was able to defeat Morbius in this mind-bending contest. As we are pushed back more and more into the Doctor's mind and see more of his past incarnations, eventually it's enough to beat Morbius. And it is honestly quite an interesting idea that is just so briefly touched upon in this story. And the moment does, in ways, feel similar to the scene where the 13th Doctor overloads the Matrix in The Timeless Children, because in both instances the Doctor succeeds seemingly by using the wealth of the characters' experiences and knowledge against their opponent. So on the whole, I did really like the scene, but part of me wishes that I had watched this story before Series 12 aired, because it would have allowed me to see it from a different perspective. But having said that, I just like what is presented within this scene, and I'm sure I would have, even if I'd seen it, say, in 2019. And while I liked what was done here, and it seemed to me to be a fitting end to the character of Morbius, it oddly isn't quite the end of the road for that character. He actually dies when he almost gets pushed off of this cliff, though he doesn't actually really get pushed all that much. He kind of just stumbles down, and you could easily excuse this as a result of the previous mind-bending scene, but it still felt like an odd way for that character to go out by just stumbling off a cliff. Not terrible, just odd. Overall, I thought this was a really memorable serial with a fantastic level of atmosphere and a number of elements that all complemented one another and made for an incredibly engaging and noteworthy adventure. Not only are our villains really good, but our main duo is as delightful as ever. I found this to be a great story, and I'm going to give The Brain of Morbius a rating of 8.75 out of 10. That does it for today, everybody. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on this serial if you feel up to it. As always, I look forward to what you all have to say. If you join me on the 29th of August, then I will be bringing you a review of The Seeds of Doom. I'm giving myself, my editor, Bob, more time to edit because he's lazy and I also don't pay him. Okay, but for real, I need 2 weeks to edit that one because it's a fair bit longer than usual, and it gets exponentially more difficult to edit these reviews the longer they get. The hoops I have to jump through, Bob has to jump through just to get past content ID is incredible, so it's going to take just a little bit longer for this one, and I hope you enjoy what I put together and that you'll join me for that discussion of Season 13's finale, but if not, that's totally cool. Just know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, that's going to do it for now, folks. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and have a lovely week.